Hey everyone, welcome back to the Clinical Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Earl, and I'm joined today by a friend, a colleague, and a mentor, Chris Johnson, the PT. If you want to follow him on Instagram, that is his account, Chris Johnson, the PT. Chris is a wealth of knowledge, to put it very mildly, but also he's coming on to share all the things he's been working on since he first came on. If you remember, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the Clinical Leadership Podcast, Chris was our first ever guest, and he's someone that I've learned a ton from, both clinically, professionally, and athletically. I've learned a lot from him as an athlete, and so yeah, I really am honored and humbled that he would join us again, and he's going to talk about the things that he's been working on for the last few years, really, and especially as it pertains to runners. So if you are a runner yourself, or you find yourself treating runners or triathletes, then today's episode is going to be right up your alley. It's going to be something that you are really going to learn a lot from. And also, there's a couple of opportunities for you to dive a little bit deeper into some of the things that Chris talks about, and including his latest course that has just come out, the Clinical Running Essentials. So all of that we talk about on today's episode. So if you would buckle up, everybody, here we go. Our next episode with Chris Johnson. All right, welcome back to the Clinical Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Earl, and I am excited to welcome Chris Johnson back to the podcast. If you remember, Chris was our first guest back on episode 1, and we're ecstatic and really humbled to have Chris back. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex, and always good to connect with you. I actually, on that first podcast, you just brought this up before we hit record. I think was crying during that podcast for whatever reason. I mean, I think that there is something that we got into discussing, and I think it was a whole rehab to train, train to compete to redefine your limits. And I just started tearing up. So it was a very memorable podcast, not to get too cheesy, but anyways, I'm
No,
glad to be back.
that's how this works. I remember having a conversation with you remember Tim Gavitt, the workload
For
management, and we
for
hosted him for
sure.
a couple of courses, and he came from Australia, and fantastic guy, fantastic presenter, and I got dinner with him, one night, and I was driving him back to his hotel room, and we had a similar kind. I'd known this guy for like 6 hours, and like in
Yeah.
person known him. I had, of course, emailed with him, and him and I had a similar, like, very deep conversation about our kids, and him and I were both kind of getting a little teary-eyed, and we're like, what was happening? We're talking about our
Yeah.
kids, and we're getting emotional, and it was that was my favorite takeaway from our time together, was how he spoke about his kids and his relationship with his kids, which to me says everything about who he is and what he does. And he's just gone on to do some incredible things even since then. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I have quoted that. In fact, if I were to get a mural or something like that in this, in this space right now, it would be, yeah, why do we rehab? We rehab to train. Why do we train? We train to compete. Why do we compete? We compete to redefine our limits. I love that.
That's it.
That's my ethos. That's my mantra. And I'm not alone. And I definitely stole that from you. But that was a heck of an episode. That was a great one to start with. But yeah, thanks for bringing that back up.
Yeah. Cool. I think what that really speaks to, you had mentioned basically, having a similar experience driving Tim back after dinner. I think that when that happens, it's really a sign that both parties are present,
Mm.
and that's something that we don't always get to enjoy. I think people are very distracted, and, when both people are present, yeah, emotions can be overwhelming, so this happens all the time when I treat with, when I consult. And I think it's because a lot of times, if people haven't worked with me in the past, and you may have a similar experience, but, you know, we're both present. And I wrote about this in one of my newsletters. And I think when people have that kind of emotional release, it's the first sign that they're acknowledging their situation and they're starting to take ownership of it. And that's a very powerful thing. And I think, for anyone who's listening to this, really thinking about how you're structuring your treatment sessions. Are you giving people space to breathe? Is it a non-rushed session? And I think that's really important, almost more than, what goes down during the treatment, and that gets into specific effects, non-specific effects. Maxi Misiak has talked a lot about um, that topic, but yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to, because one of the other things that I do as well is I'm a consultant for rehab and sports chiropractors as they either create their business or are trying to grow their business. And I was talking to, we'll call him Ricky because that's his name. And your content
Yeah.
recently, your post recently about one of the best skills, I think you said one of the best clinical skills to have is a non-anxious presence. And Ricky and I talked about that,
Yep.
for like 15 to 20 minutes one day and how powerful that really is with the running population that he's treating. And it was really cool to just kind of unpack it because in a fast-paced world, a lot of distraction. I mean, even on this thing, like in our pockets, access to the internet, access to an ungodly amount of apps that all give us information and data, but it distracts us from possibly another human being right in front of us that's going through something and is suffering with something. And to be fully present, I think that is absolutely a skill. And so yeah, do you mind talking a little bit about maybe in your experience since we last chatted for the first podcast, just kind of like what that
Mhm.
looks like practically inside of a patient visit with you?
Yeah, and just to give a little context for people who haven't heard that phrase, a non-anxious presence, I would say a peaceful non-anxious presence. So this was an idea that I got exposed to from John Mark Comer's book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And he borrowed that phrase from this rabbi, Ed Friedman, in an incredible book called The Failure of Nerve. And, with your role in leadership, that's a book that you would love, and one of the central tenets of that book is, empathy without accountability is a recipe for trouble. You're sort of thwarting the growth of that person or organism, if you will. But not to get too philosophical, those are both books you would love, though, Alex. So check them out if you haven't. Yeah, I think it starts, I'm very mindful of the clinical interaction, and I think a lot of these non-specific effects, that's where the magic lies, right? And you really have to take a step back and say, where does a user journey start? And before you connect with that person, for the treatment session, they have perhaps, researched you online. How easy was it to find you? If they did land on your website, what was that experience? If they're interested in learning more about you, did you write your about section in the first person? Were you vulnerable a little bit? Just because, we're asking patients to be vulnerable and disclose a lot of their history, things that tie into their personal life, their ecosystem. So I think if we sort of show a little bit of vulnerability too, that really fosters alliance. And then, I think that your website is a clinician or a small business owner of a clinic is a therapeutic touch point. Is it easy for someone to book the appointment? Is your offering clear? When they show up, do you deliver on that offer? How do you greet the person? So I'm sitting here in my, for ease of explanation, garage. It's my performance space or office, but when someone arrives, I say, hey, pull into the main driveway, ping me when you arrive. And this time of the year, I often have the garage door open, but I walk out to meet that person, right? I don't let them walk in. I go out and greet them. And, if they show up on time, I want to highlight that because a lot of the times when people connect with us, they sort of come in with their tail between their leg. And what I mean by that is, you know, they're in a one down position. They're dealing with an injury. They haven't been able to figure it out themselves. And it's taking precious time and energy away from their family, their job, other hobbies. So you want to equilibrate that relationship to say, hey, thanks for getting here on time. It's so nice to work with pros. Come on in. Let's get started. hey, before we do, just know that I have water. I have, if you want a snack, there's a restroom inside. You're just essentially like welcoming them into your home. And I think that really sets the stage because you and I both know, it's that first interaction and perhaps the last interaction that's part of a plan of care that are going to be the things that really, stay with that person in terms of, their memory of the experience. And I think this stuff doesn't get prioritized to the extent that, perhaps you or myself make it a priority. So,
Yeah, well, I think that I can so visualize all of that, right? And I think we've all been, even as consumers, we've been exposed to other areas of healthcare where like they just go right to the thing that they value, and that could be payment or insurance or just, convenience for them. So it's like we walk in, like I'm not going to name names or anything, but we walked into another healthcare facility even this morning, and I walked in, I said hello, and I saw the lady's name tag and I called her by her name. And she said, "Hey, Mr. Earl, by the way, here's your payment plan information. We need your signature." And I was like, "Oh, like it was so off-putting."
bad touch point.
That was
Yeah.
that was the very first thing. I had never been into this actual location, and immediately my daughter picked up on like how irritated I was. That's the first thing you're gonna say to me when I walk into your place of business for the first time. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is not to my standard, not to my liking. If anybody in my office said that directly to a consumer, we'd have a conversation, and that would be the last time that we'd have a conversation on that, because that was so off-putting. And that just shows me what the office values, or at least maybe the front desk area. And that's not the standard. That's not the message that I want to convey. And it sounds like neither do you.
No, and that practitioner that you may end up going to see isn't even aware that that's transpired. And here you are, sort of preoccupied, distracted, maybe even anxious or upset about that situation. And if you're going in, you know, looking for, some kind of therapeutic benefit or outcome, geez, that sort of undermines the whole interaction.
Uh,
So,
I'm not gonna
yeah,
lie. I was quite salty for the hour long that we were there, to the point where our 14-year-old even picked up on it. Was like, "Is everything okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, yes and no." Like I'm just irritated about that. I got over it, shortly thereafter. But now every time I go back in there, I'm gonna be thinking, what's my first touch point going to be today? Or and I don't want that. Like I'm there for a reason, and I don't want to harbor any resentment. But it was just, if that's your first touch point, that might not be a winning strategy in my book. I'm just gonna say it. So
well, it's a transactional relationship,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
so, our goal is to basically get to a more personal relationship, obviously respecting professional boundaries, but yeah, that's how you sink the ship. If you're a small business
yeah.
owner in the healthcare space, really any industry,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
you're right. And I want to go back to something you said earlier about John Mark Comer. So a friend of mine gave me his book, that Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, because he highlights the Sabbath about, having a day of rest, and so that
Yeah.
really was a very timely book, that my friend Aaron gave or just recommended. I can't remember if he bought me a copy or he just recommended. So that put John Mark Comer on my radar. And that was one of the first books in a while where I was just like reading and thinking, "Oh my goodness, I got goosebumps," just thinking about like the depth that he was going into about just rest, and
Yeah.
that helped, that helped a lot. And so yeah, I am familiar with John Mark Comer, and not the other book that you mentioned, but I'll definitely check out that other one. But yeah, no, I want to learn more about kind of what you've been up to, and I want to give you plenty of time to talk about your recent running course that you put on. But yeah, I guess what's been new in your world besides a pretty awesome beard that you got growing there?
Just honestly trying to get back to having fun with sport and reading and spending time with my kids. People always ask, they're like, "What are you training for?" And I'm like, "Nothing," and it's awesome,
Yeah,
right? Um, I suppose I'm training, so my kids catch me in the act. I think that's a very powerful thing because they start mirroring. Like my son will walk out here. He may even walk out here during the podcast
Yeah.
and pick up a 20 kilogram, he can basically deadlift his body weight. And I never bring any of this stuff up. And then he'll like show a big flex. But just trying to slow down a little bit, hang out with my family. Summer in Seattle is spectacular, but I had my mom out here over the summer, so I flew back to Pittsburgh, drove her cross country over the course of 6 days. She
Wow.
doesn't fly, so it's one of those opportunities that I knew that if I didn't take advantage of it, that she may never spend a summer in Seattle. And my kids are in an age, they're 7 and 9, where they're sort of yearning for time with Gigi, is what they call her. So yeah, but other than that, as you mentioned, pulling this course together, which was a really heavy lift, and I sort of presented it as my magnum opus. And people said, "How long did it take for you to do this course?" And I always smirk. I said, "About 25 years." And and I really mean that. I'm just about to finish Cal Newport's book, Slow Productivity, and I've had you've seen a lot of this presentation, live, but there is always a lot that I didn't get around to discussing, whether, I taught portions of this solo or if Nathan and I were teaming up for the bones, tendons, weights, and whistles course. But I wanted sort of an A to Z talking about from the time someone lands with me with an injury or an MSK complaint all the way back to having them race professionally or find the pointy end of sharp if they're a competitive age group, or just running in a healthy manner where they're training consistently and their body's adapting. So but it was a heavy lift, so yeah, I'm still recuperating from it. So
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about the course because I know I think a lot of people that listen to this know who you are from either Instagram or they're on your own, they've just been following your stuff. So tell us a little bit about, who the course is designed for, what kind of what they're going to get from it because running is, is it sprinters versus long distance? Like what type of running are we talking about here?
yeah, it's mainly distance running. I weave in a lot of stuff related to working with triathletes, but triathletes always get injured with running. So, you end up really just needing to understand running to help them. Not to say they don't get, issues with their shoulder from swimming. Most cycling issues stem from trauma, which are clavicle fractures, scapular fractures, rib fractures. Um, and no cyclist or triathlete goes in to seek rehab. They're pretty stoic and they're like, oh, I'll just sort of reintegrate. Um, but yeah, I wanted a comprehensive resource, which is the whole kit and caboodle. So, um, if you look on the registration or sales page, I provide the whole curriculum. And I also want to give people samples of what they're going to get. So if you haven't had a chance, check out the curriculum, watch the free videos. My goal is for people to go to that registration or sales page and come away smarter because there's probably about like 20 to 30 minutes of content there. But we get into obviously the performance demands of running, the biomechanics, which is what people love to, focus on. Understanding how to speak with runners, right?
Mm.
Runners will sniff you out really quick if you know what you're doing or don't know what you're doing. So there's a lot of motivational interviewing, therapeutic alliance. We get into understanding what's point A. And this is one of the biggest pitfalls I see is when a runner connects with a rehab pro, really locking in and understanding where are they at this very moment. So Dan John, the great strength coach, Fulbright scholar, always talks about point A. What is point A? You have to clearly define that because we know what point Z is. Point Z is running in sort of a careless, reckless, thoughtless manner, and you can get away with doing anything, right?
Right.
Um, and then I go through all the exercises that you see bits and pieces of on Instagram and social. We also go through lower limb tendinopathy, with the key sites, the same thing with bone stress injury management. And then I also get into what does performance coaching look like? And I think that's where a lot of people drop the ball is, they may get someone out of rehab, but then right when you're trying to pass a baton back to the athlete, perhaps back to their coach, I see things go south. People may plug in prematurely to speed work if they're coming off of a bone stress injury only to relapse. So I talk a lot about, how I approach working with runners and triathletes, now that they're out of my hands as a physical therapist or rehab pro, what does training look like? So I have two separate businesses. I have the PT business, and then I have a coaching business, right? And it's a little bit of a different mentality. I mean, with coaching, I'm trying to put someone on the brink of their abilities while protecting consistency of training. And with rehab, you're much more cognizant of, okay, we still need to be conservative here. They're back to participation, but not yet sport. So yeah, it sort of covers that whole spectrum. And it's really rich with a lot of, images and exercises. My goal was to basically really cover the essentials. If it was information or content that I didn't apply in the last 3 to 4 weeks in my clinical and coaching work, it didn't make it into the course. So it was one of those things where I started to just ruthlessly try to trim it to just make sure it was the essentials, no fluff.
So the course is called Clinical Running Essentials, correct?
Correct. That's the title of
Cool.
it. Yep.
That's the title of it. And so
Yeah.
it's for runners and also for clinicians that deal that in the treatment of runners, or specifically this is more of a clinical course to help those, the people like me that want to learn everything that we can from you, right? Would you say this is, obviously it's a clinical course and we've got some accreditation that we have behind it, but would you recommend like an actual runner, take this course, or is this someone that you kind of it's pretty heavy on scientific, research and you're very well versed in citing your sources. I mean, the way that you talk about your sources, it's almost like they're sitting right next to you, like, hey, that's so and so. And so is that
Yeah.
more geared towards the clinician to treat the runner, or do you recommend runners take this as well?
No, I would say it's really for rehab pros. I would say a technically minded runner, a coach would benefit from it, but I'm really getting into the weeds of, what goes into managing a bone stress injury or a lower limb tendinopathy, how you evaluate a runner from a functional assessment standpoint, as well as on the examination table. So yeah, I mean, that's a crux of it. And I try to take a lot of that information and sort of package it in a way and put it out on social for runners, so because that's the end user, right? But yeah, this is a clinical course. So there
Yeah,
will be a part two, which
sure.
will get
Yeah.
into some other stuff that I can't disclose yet, but I'll sort of,
But I
yeah,
think
put it out
that
there.
I went on a trail run yesterday and with a friend from church, actually the guy that recommended the book of Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, and then also another guy from church, and the guy was kind of our guide. His name's Jeremy, and I was asking because we started we're at the base of Lookout Mountain here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then we ran up about 3/4 of the way up Lookout Mountain to like what's called Craven's house, which is a pretty steep incline. Like at some point there's like 22% incline. So we were walking that, but it
Yeah.
was a long run, right? And I'm not really a trail runner and I haven't done hills in a long time. And I asked Jeremy, how much further, are we going? And
Yeah.
he kind of smirked at me and was like, well, a little bit, maybe it's a little bit longer, maybe it's a little bit shorter. Gave me like such a vague non-answer, and then he said, "Well, I was kind of hoping to just, he said something to the effect of like, well, ignorance is bliss, and like, I know
Hmm.
I know where we're going, and you'll get there, but do you really want to know how much longer?" And there was probably a dozen separate times where if I was by myself, I would start walking, where I was like, I definitely would have lost
Yeah.
the mental battle, but because I was with two guys that just kept going, um, and including the downhill, like the way that he even framed running downhill and having an opportunity to learn the skill of timing your steps on the rocks. was how he phrased it. And he's like, have fun with it going
Yeah.
downhill. And I was like, wait a minute here, this is crazy. And I'm running and I'm taking the
Yeah.
switchbacks. I'm like, this, I haven't done this in years, like probably since I was a kid. And I'm shredded sore today. But as I was reflecting on that, that experience just yesterday, his optimism, but also the ignorance of me knowing what probably would have worked against me is kind of how I envision this course for your average runner, that it's a little bit, it's very heavy clinically speaking, and maybe a little ignorance is actually bliss for the runner who just needs to kind of focus on the bigger picture and not necessarily a course like this. If you get my analogy, if that makes sense at all. Um, because it's really
Yeah,
for the
for sure.
clinician, it's really for the clinicians to provide the best approaches and strategies for runners that are not necessarily rational beings, and myself included. Like I fully admit, I don't have a lot of
Yeah.
fortitude with running, and my mental I lose the mental battle more often than I care to admit. To be honest, maybe that's just the novice runner in me. But yeah, so clinicians, rehab pros. Obviously, our group is heavily, chiropractors, rehab chiropractors. So, yeah, I guess tell us how you see this course fitting into a rehab professional like a sports chiro. How does this course help them in the treatment of runners?
It's going to give them the exact framework. Before I answer that question, though, with your anecdote, have you read Michael Easter's book, The Comfort Crisis?
No, I haven't.
No, pick up a copy. I mean,
Okay.
because what you essentially just described, I think he uses a term. I think it's a Japanese term called inanagi, which is basically like you're going to go out and do something that's really challenging that you're pretty confident you can finish, but there's also an element of like, what have I gotten myself into? And yeah, he speaks to the importance of having excursions like that. Yeah, so you'll love it. I think he was on Huberman's podcast. I haven't listened to
Oh,
that
cool.
episode, but I enjoyed the book and I recommend it to a lot of people. But um, yeah, I mean, this is basically the framework that I've arrived at, which is always going to continue to get refined with emerging literature. But this is how I think about managing runners, who consult me. So I think it really covers all of the ground that you need to know as a rehab pro. And, I think you appreciate this more than a lot of people, but, the best rehab professionals operate in a somewhat similar manner. I think historically, PTs and chiropractors were thought as very distinct entities, but, the best people that I know in both fields kind of approach things in a pretty similar manner, right? And I think that we have strengths and weaknesses as a function of our didactic training. But, when we're working with runners, I always remind clinicians and rehab pros that running has predictable performance demands. This is not rocket science, right? So we shouldn't run into so many issues trying to get someone back to consistent, healthy training. A lot of the times we're really having to navigate behavior change, getting people to change, the relationship with running, how they're approaching their training intensity distribution, while understanding how running interfaces with their life or ecosystem. So I try to really provide a lot of, actionable information, exercises, and give people a lens into my thought process because, every day I pull up my email and people are like, hey, I picked up X, Y, and Z, or I had this like outcome that I've never had with a runner before. And that just validates the whole reason I put the course out. So yeah, I mean, it's really sort of an A to Z. The one thing I don't get too into, if people are interested in this, is postpartum running. I help a lot of postpartum runners, but I think there are pelvic floor therapists that, do a better job and have more reps in terms of that specific subdomain. So
Oh, that's great. I think
yeah,
I, I think
yeah,
I think you're right. I think pelvic floor, postpartum. My wife's had 5 kids. I think that's definitely something that I should say undervalued, but I think it's definitely something that's emerging when it comes to running. Because it's definitely a musculoskeletal event. Giving birth. So
yeah,
it's one of the most
for
athletic
sure.
events, and yeah, it's actually a lot of fun. obviously I'm not the one doing it, but it's like
Fun for you.
yeah, fun for me, but I don't know, there's just something very gracious about watching a woman in labor give birth and then like the immediate joy of like new life, you know, it's like it's
Yeah.
pretty special, I'm not gonna lie. And in a weird way, I'm like very attracted to my wife as she's in labor giving birth, and I'm like, this is, I think, because it's just so brave. I think I'm like attracted to
Yeah.
the bravery and the courage, and knowing what her body is going through, and she's doing it anyway. And it's like, this is amazing. You know, that's why she's the rock in our family for sure. Um, yeah, I didn't know I was going to share birthing details, you know, on today's today's recording.
Yeah.
But no, I also think it's helpful to know like what you specialize in and what lane you're good at. Because I tell people all the time, like I'm okay with concussion work, but there are, you know, board certified, Carrick trained neurologists that are chiros that like blow me out of the water when it comes to neuro stuff and concussion related return to sports and stuff. Like I'll do the basic, and I can dabble a little bit in it. But if you want to see a specialist, like you got to go see Dr. Mike in the Chicagoland area for him. But I I I do think that's a sales proposition for people. Like if a postpartum runner wants to seek your services, I think it's the most responsible thing to be like, you know what, I actually don't thrive, or I don't have the maybe the best resume to help you, but here's who does, you know. I think that that's just
Yeah.
a recipe for success for the patient, right? And ultimately, we're patient-centered clinicians, right? So I shouldn't be taking everybody on. I should be getting somebody, the most appropriate provider. That would be my due diligence. That would be my responsibility. And
Hmm.
so therefore, I shouldn't be saying yes to every patient that wants to work with me. Just like not every patient's going to say yes, they want to work with me. I'm not batting 1,000. I don't think you are either. But yeah,
No.
so yeah, I like it. I think you put out a lot of great content, just kind of pivoting over to like the content that you put online. I love your silent videos. I love how you leave them to like broadly open to interpretation for us to use, how we deem fit, in our own practices. I also want to just give you a nice shout out for your performance tests. I went through your course at Nathan's facility. Goodness, I don't know what year it was. It was the first time I took a class with you. And the physical
Hmm.
performance tests were, I mean, I had notes and notes and notes about just what you're looking for during some very standard and simple performance tests, and then all the way to your more, I don't know what you want to say, more complete, more comprehensive, like what you call the Johnson table test, or just do you call it the Johnson table test? You call
Hmm.
it the table test. I love that,
Yeah.
and
Table torsion test. Yep.
table torsion test. I love that test. And every
Yeah.
time I pull that out to like someone's like, "What are you doing? I've never seen this before." And I'm like, "Well, I know a guy who taught me this." And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's
Yeah.
a really cool test, and I think you've just been very generous with your not just your time, but also your resources and just the content that you put online. So yeah, I think the way that I think about this course as well, if I'm a consumer, is you've already given so much of value to us as rehab professionals for free online. I can't imagine what I'm actually going to get when I pay for your course. And so that's the way I like to market as well, is like not necessarily tease people, but give people glimpses of what's to come, because whatever you pay for is going to be amplified and exponentially more beneficial to you. So that's why I like it, Chris. And so I think a lot of
Oh,
people,
thanks.
well, that's not just the reason. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a reason.
Yeah, for
But no,
sure.
so yeah, I guess just tell us about how do people take the course, where they find out more information about it. Let's talk details here, because I know even in our coaching group, I've got two coaching groups going. I said I was going to interview you, and I could tell that people that I know want to specialize with runners are going to sign up for this course. So how do they learn more about it? How do they sign up for the course?
Yeah. So I would first say I have zero expectations. This is something that I produced with the goal of trying to elevate the standard of care, because when I was younger, I didn't know who to turn to. I was, dealing with some serious MSK issues, and no one really understood running. So my goal is to try and just leave the rehab world better off and say, here's a framework that I use, and Everyone brings a different skill set background to the equation, but you can sort of infuse those skills into this framework. But yeah, if you go to chrisjohnsonpt.com, you'll see it on the homepage. And as I mentioned before, worst case scenario, just go and work through the sample videos because there is a ton of gold in there. And, why do people love going to Costco or one of these big, grocery warehouses? It's because of the free samples, right? So I want people to, as I mentioned, come away from that sales page with a refined understanding of exercise prescription, the implications of, imaging as it relates to tendinopathy and how that can sort of mislead you, some considerations around introducing something like a pogo jump in the context of a tibial bone stress injury and why that may seem like a relatively low level plyo, but when you understand the forces that are going on at the tibia, that's a pretty aggressive entry point relative to doing something like a counter movement jump, where you're distributing those forces throughout the lower extremity, really the body, as opposed to concentrating them at the calf muscle complex. Um, so, yeah, and my goal with all of this stuff is I am into doing acts of service. I've had a really, I've been fortunate to have trained around a lot of people. I've had the good fortune of having good health and being able to compete in running and triathlon is all as well as having a lot of people trust their care to me. So it's pulling all of those different experiences together, while trying to synthesize the medical and performance literature and basically package it in a way to say, here's my understanding of the injury to performance spectrum and working with runners. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think that's I could see why it takes so long for someone like you to put a course like this together because it's almost like drinking from a fire hose every year with the different
Mhm.
literature that's coming out. I mean, tendinopathy literature is coming out now that's different even from as recent as 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Bone density metrics have changed over my 10 years of being a chiropractor now. So there's just been so many changes. It's almost tough for us to keep up with, to be honest. And so to have almost like a home base in terms of not just this course, but the other material that you put out there is obviously it's an understatement to say it's a an important or a vital piece of our clinical careers if we're dealing with runners. So yeah, kudos to you for putting it all together and to try to help us. I love the acts of service because I'm like you, man. Yes, I want to make a lot of money. Don't get me wrong. I want to make a lot of money. I want to bless a lot of people, but like I don't really want to do much further than that. I want to just help people, patient wise, I want to help people. Professionally, I want to help people with their business or with their clinical outcomes. And that's why you and I are aligned on the family front, on the priorities that we have. And also, you said something via text to me about, we're collaborating on this podcast episode. We're not, there's not a competition. Competition happens at the bottom. And I love that. I absolutely love that because I've
Yeah.
never understood, even when I was in chiropractic school and we had to formulate our business plans and stuff like that. I remember I never wrote a competitor down. You're supposed to do a SWOT analysis and do all that, and you're supposed to say who's a competitor in your market. And I always left it blank. And whenever the
Yeah.
professors or teachers would really press me for it, my response was, I don't have any competitors. Like nobody's going to do what I do. And I had a little bit of arrogance, not a little, I had a lot of arrogance about what I was going to do and who I was going to help, and nobody was going to do it at the level that I could. To the point where nowadays, I bet you 95% of the patients I've treated over the last decade have no idea what my business name is. They have no idea what my clinic is
Hmm.
called. We spend a lot, an ungodly amount of time stressing over what our business is going to be called, what our website's going to look like, and you touched on that just a little bit. But I don't think anything um, sells better, for lack of a better word, than just your like personal brand and like who you are as a person when it enters into the conversation in the arena of clinical care. People would just say, I've seen Earl or I've seen Alex, and if you have an injury or something like that, you got to go see him. They don't ever say, go see
Yeah.
Active Health and Restoration. They don't know that that's my
Yeah.
business name.
Yeah.
And it's because of the high quality care and the caring deeply for my patients model that I've emulated from guys like you and some other mentors as well. So which you get all that, and obviously I'm echoing
Mhm.
things that you've said over the years. But yeah, any thoughts business wise on how maybe people that specialize in working with runners, some things that you've maybe, I mean, because you talked about website and booking, you kind of
Mhm.
just casually, you just very quickly drop that in there, drop those nuggets. Anything else that you would like to share on the business side to help people that treat runners regularly?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think first, always try to refine your craft. People sniff out if you don't know what you're doing, right? But I also, I find myself mentoring a lot of, younger clinicians, whether they're solopreneurs, small group practices. And, I'm always saying, what are your points of differentiation? I don't want to see you posting the same stuff that everyone else is. Like I open up social and people are getting their reps. I continue to get reps under my belt, but I'm always saying, what's your unique perspective stance? What are your points of differentiation? Right. Because I think that's what allows you to stand out and also take a stand on things. One of my major gripes when I was in the research world is, you read this paper, there's a lot of important information. And then, and this is also one of the benefits of research is saying, but we still don't really know what this means. I want people to take a stance. How does this impact clinical care? Right. Um, so yeah, always think of, what are your points of differentiation? And I also think to be a little bit vulnerable, show sides of yourself without oversharing, right? And that's how I sort of use my newsletter is to, yeah, I talk about running a lot. I talk about life. I'm in a very reflective state. Um, but I feel like people are doing a lot of cookie cutter stuff. And I think that if they really just slowed down and thought about the situation and the content they're putting out, that it could be more impactful.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
absolutely. No, I love it. I love it. I think back in 2020, 5 years ago, when that thing, plagued our whole, world. It's crazy that was 5 years ago, right? I think that you could really see who was standing on their convictions during that time. I'm not saying we have to, agree on everything, but you could really tell the people that came out and took a stand, right? And they say that conviction is something you die for, right? A belief is something that you live for. A conviction is something you die for, and there are some hills that I absolutely am willing to die on. But again, not to be, too vulnerable or to put myself out there like that, but I genuinely think that if everyone is looking left, you gotta look right. If everyone is going left, you gotta
Mhm.
go right. If everyone's saying jump, I say crawl. Like not to be a contrarian, because that almost has a negative connotation to it. Um, but to be willing to look a little bit laterally when things, and I honestly think that's the lens that's kind of given me a little bit of a competitive edge. Because I even tell patients. Yes, I'm a chiropractor. Yes, I can adjust you. I can needle you. I can do soft tissue. But am I really going to adjust you better than the five other chiropractors you've seen? Am I really going to needle you better than a physical therapist? Or am I going to tape or scrape you better than the five other people you've seen? In reality, sure, maybe there's degrees of competency, but really what you're going to find the most relief from is the plan. It's the
Mhm.
future. It's not just what I can do with you inside of a session, but it's this program that we're going to build together. That's kind of what I sell people is a program, not a session. It's a program. And once they can start to see, some of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, then they're like, okay, this guy's different. Because I'm not just come in, get adjusted 3 times a week for the next 6 months, which is what they're expecting, And I'm sure with you,
Mhm.
they're expecting, hey, what 3 exercises should I do today, based on this session? And you're probably like, oh, were you not
Mhm.
listening the last 40, 45 minutes
Mhm.
to anything that I talked about with sleep and nutrition and hydration and recovery? Like, no, like that what they want, they're conditioned to ask for what exercises should I do at home. So I'm sure you have story after story about where they just kind of missed the plot after one of your initial evals, I'm guessing.
Yeah. And I would say, as you mentioned, like other entrepreneurial nuggets, I'm always trying to say, like, I would pose this to you, and I don't know if anyone, what's your superpower that can't be copied? You know,
That's a great question.
because
Yeah.
yeah, because that's what you need to double down on, you know.
Yeah.
Um, So, and I also, I think about this book from the Heath brothers, The Power of Moments, which is awesome. It's like that experience when someone connects with you has to be memorable and compelling, right? It has to address what that person's needs are for first and foremost. But you want to give people an experience that, they leave thinking, wow, like what just happened? So because what happens, they go and they share that with friends, family. And if it's a good experience, they're raving about you. If it's a bad experience, they're throwing you under the bus, So the marketing kind of takes care of itself. But the other thing that I would mention on this topic is like you mentioned the importance of the plan. Your follow-up is so darn important. If you can craft a detailed email that's not too long-winded, that gives people an actionable plan that has links if you're suggesting exercises, that's going to down-regulate someone's nervous system. It's going to reduce their anxiety because they're like, okay, now I have this plan that I actually had a say in what was crafted, right? Because they're going to be much more likely to follow a plan that they were involved in creating. So, yeah, I
I
found
think
that very important.
I think it's huge, but I also think that it as patients especially they don't always remember what we say, and if I ever catch myself saying, well, I'll send you a recap email, and if I don't, well, then they're kind of hanging, hey, is he going to send? Sometimes they text me, hey, where's that follow-up email? I'm like, oh
Yeah.
shoot, I forgot. So I don't like to leave people hanging. Um, but also, they, like I said a minute ago, they don't necessarily remember everything that I say. But when they can read it, right now they can start to perceive what this actually looks like, what the structure looks like. And my own business coach says that people aren't necessarily convinced by what they see, they're convinced by what they read. And so if you send a really
Yeah.
nice nurtured email after that or the follow-up email after that initial consult, man, I'd say I don't want to put an arbitrary number on it, but I would say 50 to 75% of their nerves just get, calmed, like you said,
Mhm.
down-regulated, simply because they're reading, your thoughts on them specifically. So awesome. This is great, Chris. You got to come back again in a couple of years, when the next, incredible resource that you produce, I'm sure it'll be less than that, but yeah, we'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah.
But I hate to cut us off here, but I do want to make sure that we get everything that we've caught up, and we've shared everything. Is there any closing remarks or any comments or anything you want to share with our audience as we wrap up?
Well, I say this a lot, but life is about relationships. So I always say double down relationships with people who you genuinely care about. That's why we're on this podcast. We maintain communication since we first connected, and to also just be patient, revel in the process. I think that you probably have this experience. All the athletes I work with, I'm just trying to get them to slow down, to operate in harmony with biology, to realize that if you're trying to hack biology, you're a hack, right? So yeah, no, that's it. If people have questions, feel free to reach out. If you, hopefully, you get a chance to check out the sales page for the course. I poured my heart and soul into that. I developed more gray hairs in my beard. But everyone who's taken the course, no one complains about. People have loved the course, and they're like, "Hey, I'm 15% of the way through this, and I have come away with so much, and I can't believe there's still like, you know." 85% to
Yeah.
go, right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's my magnum opus as I call it. So, and the beauty of it, I'm treating it as SaaS, software as a service. So, I'll continue to refine and update. I had to pull back a little bit after the launch just because I had to breathe and sort of like,
Sure.
gather myself. But
Oh yeah.
yeah, I'll continue to refine it as the medical and performance literature emerges. So
Awesome.
I just want
Awesome.
to thank you for having me on. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the summer with your family.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I think your quote right there about if you try to hack biology, you're a hack. I think that's my takeaway. I think that's my number one
Yeah.
takeaway from today. That's a good one. So, same to you,
Yeah.
my friend.
Cool.
I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer with your family and everybody listening to this. Keep an eye out. When we kind of launch this episode, publish this episode, we'll have all the show notes where you can connect with Chris and view the sales page and ask us questions if you have any issues or any concerns or any inquiries that you want. We're here to help. So. Again, Chris, thanks for coming on. Thanks for taking time out of your day to talk, clinical, business, life, books, all that stuff. You're a wealth of knowledge, my friend, and I'm really grateful to have you back on. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.